Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start. I'm Alaire Townsend, Chair of the Advisory Board. Let's go around the table and then around the room so we all know who's here.
I'm Lisa Neary, the General Counsel of IBO.
Anna Oliveira, a new member, very pleased to be here.
Jack Groskup, I'm a member and I teach in the School of Public Affairs at Baruch College.
I'm Paul Wachtel. I teach at the Stern Business School at NYU, and I've been on the council here for a couple of years.
And I'm Ronnie Lowenstein. I'm Director of the City's Independent Budget Office.
All right.
Oh, I'm Stephanie Cranes and I work at the Independent Budget Office.
Good morning, I'm Amber Green. I'm the Director of Policy for the Public Advocate's Office.
I'm Jeffrey Profiter. I'm Property Tax Analyst here at the IBO.
Frank Basilico, Deputy Director at IBO.
George Sweeting, another Deputy Director.
Diana Zamora, Budget Analyst in the Education Division.
I'm Sam Levine, the Deputy Budget Director from the Manhattan Borough President's Office.
I'm Sean Campion, I'm a Budget Analyst here at IBO.
I'm Paul Lopato, I'm the Supervising Analyst here at IBO.
Tim Mulligan from the Controller's Office.
AJ Basili from Borough President Otto's office.
I'm Doug Turetsky, Chief of Staff and Communications Director for IBO.
Well, a special welcome to Anna. She's the newest member of our advisory board. She's the president and CEO of the New York Women's Foundation, and she's filling the slot on the board for, quote, an officer of a civic or public interest advocacy organization involved in budgetary matters. And she is replacing Rich Murray, who was in the position briefly before being named budget deputy mayor in the de Blasio administration. Our second new member was not able to be here today. That's Don Boyd. He's replacing Tony Shores in the slot for a nationally recognized budget expert. And I'm happy to report that he has just successfully completed treatment for lymphoma and is home recovering, and he expects to be at the next meeting. So we're very pleased to have you here.
Thank you.
We have to pass on the minutes until we get a quorum. Let's go to Ronnie's director's report.
I just wanted to speak briefly about a couple of upcoming publications and what we're about to be up to. We've got 3 pieces coming out in the not too distant future. Every time I give a specific, I'm always wrong. But they're on 3, I think, huge issues that are very much in the news. One on health insurance coverage, another on homelessness, and a third on mentally ill in the city's jails. Let me start by just saying on the first piece that will be out will be on regional differences in health insurance coverage across New York State. It's well known that New York City has a disproportionately high share of individuals who are on Medicaid. But the question is why? And to explore why, we looked within New York State and divided the state into 3 regions, the city, the downstate suburbs, and upstate New York, and explored the different demographic and economic differences between the regions in an effort to try to ferret out why the very high levels of Medicaid here. I don't want to give away any of the results, but demographics alone aren't enough to explain it. And the authors went on to look at some potential, at least partial explanations, and have come up with some interesting hypotheses. The next one is trends in family shelter entry. For a long time, we had been pushing the Department of Homeless Services for information on individuals entering and exiting shelters. We've done a lot of work in this field, but always based on the aggregates, and there's a limit to how much you can tease out from those aggregate numbers, because there are always people going into shelters and staying in shelters and leaving shelters, all on different schedules. So finally, the department was able to provide us with some numbers. It's not everything we wanted. It goes, the data series goes from 2002 through 2012. And particularly for the early years, the data isn't nearly as complete as we'd like. Moreover, we weren't able to get addresses of people exiting shelters, but we were able to get addresses for people entering shelter. And so the first piece we're putting out based on the database is looking at trends for people who entered city homeless shelters from 2002 through 2012. More specifically, looking at the department's explanation for the primary reason they entered shelter, whether it was domestic violence or eviction or something else. The type of housing these people lived in prior to shelter, whether it was rent-regulated, NYCHA, private, non-regulated, or whatever, and the neighborhoods they come from. And I think it paints an interesting picture of people entering New York City shelters. And the last of the three is probably the most hot-button issue. It's mental health services and discharge planning for inmates of New York City jails diagnosed as mentally ill. On any given day, there are about 4,200 mentally ill inmates in city jails.
What's the total jail capacity?
I don't have that on the top of my head. Do you know?
Range of 15,000, something like that.
So nearly a quarter.
Yeah. But if you want to stack it up against something, that's just about equal to the number of inpatient psychiatric beds here in the city. So Rikers is by far the biggest
Inpatient
psychiatric facility. Yeah, you've got it. So we're looking at trends in the number of mentally ill, and we're also looking more specifically at discharge planning. Many of you, I'm sure, know that there was a case back in the late 90s called the Brad H. litigation on behalf of mentally ill city jail inmates who at the time of release were being dropped off in the middle of the night in Queensboro Plaza with 2 tokens and $1.50 in cash. No medical referrals, no housing referrals, no plan for treatment, no anything. There was a settlement in 2003, and this data is allowing us to look at just how the city has lived up to that particular agreement. There's, of course, a task force that the mayor appointed recently on this. We're expecting a report from them shortly. I'm confident that there'll be city council hearings on this as well, and we're trying to rush this through to get it into the mix. The next big agency-wide publication we're going to produce is the options volume. We've done a lot of work over the past year to move the options volume to a fall release, which I think really makes more sense from the point of view of the city's elected officials. We're going to try to put that information out there just as they're starting to think about budgets. At least that's the plan. And just make it even more useful for the city's elected officials. And last thing I wanted to say was that just another major focus for the agency for the upcoming year is going to be the economics and revenues. This has always been important to us, but we've put less emphasis on it in recent years. The number of economists had declined. Anyway, we're trying to do some things with economics. You know, we've hired 2 economists, as I mentioned, one to work on property taxes, the other to work on business income taxes and business issues in general. We've long been satisfied with our U.S. macroeconomic forecast, which really underlies everything we do. We purchase it, and we've had little latitude to change it in a way that's more than ad hoc, little pieces here and there. So we're trying to develop a more holistic way to make changes in our U.S. macro forecast when we're unhappy with the forecast we purchase from economy.com, and flow them through to the local model for the local economy and, of course, for city tax revenues. I think we're also, another big thing that we're doing is we just recently reached a data sharing agreement with the Department of Labor. That's for the first time going to give us a lot of information, labor information on individuals here in the state and in the city. And we've never had access to it before, and we're really looking forward to it. Using it not just for economic forecasting purposes and a lot of hopeful insight into really what's going on with the city's labor force and the share of New Yorkers who are in the labor force and out of it, which is a huge issue both at the city level and nationally. But also, I think it'll do a lot for our economic development research efforts as well. And finally, assuming all of this is chugging along, and we've got strong people covering each of the major taxes, we're going to start looking more closely at city tax burden questions. I'm sure everybody understands the difference. The statutory incidence of a tax can be very different from its economic incidence. So for the property tax, the statutory incidence is the landlord, or the owner or the landlord who pays the tax bill. But in practice, a lot of that burden, particularly in tight rental markets, gets passed on to the renters. And so, over time, we hope to come up with a better picture of exactly who bears the burden. But that's going to be a multi-year pursuit. So having said all of that, a lot of stuff is going on, which we feel really good about. Thank you.
Thank you. We've been joined by Greg Walker. Welcome, Greg. Nancy, then Jack.
Yeah, Ronnie, I have a process question. In the case, say, of the homeless family report, do you share your findings first with, say, DHS before you publish it, and similarly with corrections before you publish? I mean, do you give them a chance to review your review?
Yes. In large part, we're working so closely with agency data. We have to really keep in touch. I mean, it's rare that we're not in touch with the agencies throughout the process because we've got tons of questions and there's a lot of back and forth. Mm-hmm. They don't really have control over what we put out.
Is there a final, do they have to do a final sign-off? No.
No, absolutely not. If that wouldn't happen.
You wouldn't be the independent budget office.
Or we would never release anything. No, they don't have to. No, there's no sign off, and we do get appeals. We think this wording is unfair, that kind of stuff. And there are sometimes we just agree to disagree, and it's over. We also do other outside reviews, all of which is quality control.
Yeah.
Thanks.
With the two reports on homelessness and mental health in the jails, is there an opportunity to look at the extent to which those populations are in common and flow through both of those systems?
Probably not. We've got, do we have names or identifiers? I mean, no, we're not going to have the names of people. We have identifiers for people. But we don't know it's Will Smith who lives on 51st Street.
Maybe somebody who comes from a jail and lists that as their last address when they go into a homeless shelter. You said you were.
But we wouldn't know that they came from a jail. There's no.
Those two systems, I don't think, can talk to each
They
other.
don't speak to each other.
And there are all sorts of privacy violations that might be. I mean, so even when we're getting information like on labor force information on individuals, we've got a code number for them. Same thing for all of our education data. We've got a code number for each student. We don't know who that student is.
So when people give you their last address before they go into a shelter, you're not seeing jails.
No, we wouldn't see that.
I don't think.
Maybe DHS does.
The other thing is the corrections data that we're using for the mental health piece. That does not include any individual level data. The homeless shelter data, we do have, it's individual families and individuals, but not on the corrections side.
But I remember, Jack, and I'm sure you do too, that there was a study a few years ago that showed, whatever X% of the single individuals in homeless shelters had come from a correctional facility. So somebody did that study, but
I think that was actually done by the agencies. There was an initiative early in the Bloomberg administration to link up corrections and DHS.
I remember it being a pretty high percentage.
Yeah, the same issue with child welfare for kids who'd been in foster care and ended up in the shelters.
Perhaps our subsequent paper.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, let's drop back to the agenda and approve the minutes of the June 2nd meeting. May I have a motion? Okay, Nancy and was second. Okay, thank you. Are there any comments, corrections? All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Thanks. Okay, now we have two staff presentations. Ronnie, you want to introduce them?
Okay, first up, is Sean gonna be first up? Yeah. Oh, no, Paul's, no, we're switching order, sorry. Paul Lopato is going to speak about the shifting priorities and caseloads at the city's Office of Child Support Enforcement.
Good morning.
Good morning.
One of the lesser known but very important social service programs in New York City is the Office of Child Support Enforcement, which I'm going to refer to for short as OCSE from now on. OCSE exists in the Human Resources Administration, and its function is to help the custodial parents of children under 21 to collect child support from non-custodial parents who live off-site. It turns out that in about 90% of the cases, the custodial parent is the mother, non-custodial parent is the father. So for simplicity's sake, I'm going to refer to the custodial parent as the mother, non-custodial parent as the father. OCSE operates under federal law so that it's able to collect child support payments from fathers throughout the United States, and in some cases even from other countries. The original federal law was passed in 1975, and at this time, one of the big issues in the country was the rise in welfare caseloads. So there was kind of a backlash against that. And this law was primarily intended to sort of hunt down the fathers in cases where the mother was on welfare and get them to make child support payments, therefore alleviating the stresses on the welfare system and saving the taxpayer money. As such, the original process was mostly a punitive one, in which operated on a series of increasing sanctions. So the father would be identified, the court order was obtained, he had a child support amount was set. If he didn't start paying, then he began to pay sanctions like withholding tax refunds. If that didn't work, they'd suspend his driver's license or his professional license. There might be a lien on the property, and in the very worst cases where a lot of money was owed and the father was fined, he could actually go to jail. Now, more recently, the philosophy has changed, particularly over the last decade, to a more kind of what they call a family-centered approach, which puts a lot more emphasis on the needs of the father for two reasons. One is that if you help him out, it turns out he's more likely to make the payments in the first place. In addition to it, it's generally believed that the presence of the father in the child's life is a good thing, so you want to get him back in some sort of way. In July, we released a report based on our study of OCSE, and based on that study, I would like to emphasize the following points. First of all, it's a large program. OCSE collected $749 million in 2012, which is the most recent year that we had detailed data. Over 90% of that went directly to the mothers, so rather than to the government. Second, collection rate is related to cash assistance status, and by cash assistance status we mean we're basing that on the status of the mother. Is she on welfare now? Was she formerly on welfare, no longer is, or was never on welfare? And that turns out to be a very powerful predictor of how well this process works. Third, the collections increased by 24% from 2007 to 2012. We were able to get data as early as 2007. In that 5 or 6 year period, we increased collections by 24%. Even if you control for inflation, that's an increase of about 11%. That was pretty impressive. So the question is, why did that happen? The increase was due to both an improved collections rate and a change in caseload. And I will get into details about that. And finally, child support collections benefit the city. Aside from benefiting the mother and the children, it's good for the city. They get some of the money back, and it's sort of in more than pays for itself. So in the first table here, I'm going to show you it's data from 2012, and this is based on an average for the fiscal year 2012, averaged over 12 months. So you can get the program in a nutshell. In the top line, it's the total number of open cases at any given time was around 407,000. Now, there are two ways for a case to be open. For mothers who are applying for welfare, they're required to work through the welfare system to begin the process of opening a child support case. For other mothers, it's voluntary, and if they want to open a case, and if they need help, all they need to do is to go to one of the 5 family courts in each of the 5 boroughs, and there's an office at each one that handles child support. The next step in the process after it's open is to try to get a child support order. OCSC goes to what is called a support magistrate in each of the family courts, and his job is to issue an order and to set an amount that's due each month based on the income of the father. In 2012, there was an average of 285,000 cases with orders out of the 407,000 open cases at any given time, which is about 70%. So you can ask the question is why wasn't it higher than that? Well, first of all, a lot of these cases were new cases, and it takes time to actually get a court order. Secondly, it can be, in many cases, difficult to establish paternity. The father denies that there's a process, and it might even involve DNA testing. That takes a while. In other cases, the mother is not totally cooperative. She may open a case and then starts to drag her feet, doesn't show up for a court hearing. They give her a certain number of attempts to come back. After a while, the case is closed. But in the meantime, that's a case without an order. And lastly, a lot of these fathers are difficult to find, particularly low-income ones. They may purposely be avoiding being found. They may not have regular employment. If they work, it may be off the books, so it's hard to track them down using the employment systems. They may not have a lease with a name on it, and they may be avoiding being found, so it can be difficult to find them. And in some cases, they're never found, and eventually the case is closed, but that takes a while. So about 70% of the cases that are open have orders. Now, just because a case is open and has an order doesn't mean that a collection is always going to come in. So the next line is, how many cases had a collection on any given month? And that was about 125,000. So out of the orders, the cases with orders, only about 44% were receiving a collection on any given month. That may seem low, although there are reasons why that is true. First of all, about a third of the cases with orders are what they call arrears-only cases. And that means these are cases where there's no longer an ongoing liability. These are old cases. The father owes nothing ongoing, but he still owes from the past when he didn't make a payment. These cases are held open for a long time, and that drives down this collection rate because they're hard to collect for by definition. Secondly, some fathers make payments, but it's sporadic. Their employment is sporadic, and they try their best, but maybe that half of the months they actually can't pay. Thirdly, in some cases, the father is paying regularly, but he loses his job, and in that case, the judge, the support magistrate, may actually temporarily set his payment at $0, but it's still considered to be an open order, and that drives down the collection rate also. And then lastly, even when you have a court order, some of these guys are hard to find. They disappear again. That drives down the rate. So the collection rate is about 44%. The overall collections, as I mentioned, is $749 million. If you average all that, the collections per case where there was actually collection was about $6,000 a year from 2012. Now this table is the exact same table I just showed you, but I've added 3 columns. One for current cash assistance status, those that are currently on cash assistance. One that shows that those that were formerly on cash assistance and those that were never on cash assistance. And the point is that status really matters a lot. For instance, if we take cases with orders as a percent of total cases, as I mentioned, it's 70%, but that varies a lot across those 3 groups. For those currently on cash assistance, it's only about 50%. For those who used to be, about 71%, and for those who were never on, it's about 78%. So why is that? Well, it turns out that cash assistance status is sort of a proxy for the economic state or the economic well-being of these cases. Not just the father, not just the mother, but the father as well. So, and you can see that in some of the other data. So that somebody currently on cash assistance, the father's less likely to have money, he's going to be harder to find, he's less likely to be able to make a payment, that sort of thing. Whereas on the other side, for somebody who's never been on cash assistance, the father's more likely to have a regular job. Not only is he easier to find, but then you can go to the employer and start regular payments and withholdings. So that's not particularly surprising there. In addition, for instance, if we look at cases with a collection as a percent of cases with orders, as I just mentioned, it was 44% overall, but that varies from 39% and 33%, all the way up to 59%. So not only are these cases that have never been on cash assistance easier to find, easier to establish an order, you're much more likely to get a collection. And very significantly, the average payments, because the income differences among them are very significant, so that for this current cash assistance case, the average payment per year is only about $2,700. For the formers, it's about $4,800, and for those never on cash assistance, it's about $7,400 a year. As a result of that, if you look at the pink line, which in these cases, the overall money collected, only about $36 million is collected from this category of current cash assistance. It's about $216 for the formers, but most of the money's coming from those never on cash assistance. It's about $500 million a year.
I find it surprising that you do so well, they do so well with former cash assistance, because there, I assume that the money goes directly into the public coffers, doesn't stick with the women and children because it's in the past. Huh?
No, in fact, it all goes in that case to the mother.
It does. That's interesting.
The only case where it's not all going to the mother is actually the current.
Yeah.
Right. Now, in that case, women or private cash assistants are required to file a child support complaint. If there's an order and the money starts coming in, she's rewarded by not only being allowed to keep her public assistance, but she gets an extra $100 for a child and $200 if there's more than one child. But the rest in that case is kept by the city. But for the rest of them, it all goes directly to the mother.
Okay. Great. Let me make sure I understand. So if somebody used to be on cash assistance and say they started this towards the end of that woman's tenure on cash assistance, started getting child support payments, and there wasn't that much paid back to the city, once she's off, the moment she's off of public assistance, then all of the money goes to that mom.
Right, with the exception of the fact that if there was an arrear back then, right?
Okay.
If the father wasn't paying when she was on cash assistance and they eventually catch him, make him pay the arrears, then some of that money goes to the city to make up for that past cash assistance. But yeah, you're right. Normally when you're on a former cash assistance case, it's going off to you.
So does the Never Cash Assistance group include people, upper income people
Yes,
too?
it does.
Yeah. So that's the.
Anybody can apply, right?
Okay.
And the reduced amount that women in current cash assistance receive is that you explain is due to limitations in whatever the regulations are
Well,
per child.
Right. I mean, the amount coming in is good. They're probably in that case the father's probably not going to be very high income either.
Right.
So that's really the big limitation.
And it's limited to what, $50 a month that goes to the city?
What happens is you get 100 to the mother or 200 to the mother, and the rest, whatever that is, goes to the city.
But those are the mothers with poorest incomes.
Exactly.
Doesn't make much sense. Okay.
So of that
Really makes no
$700+ million, how much goes to the public coffers and how much goes to the mom? Good, thank you.
So when you say that the program pays for itself, it means that the city share. Is you going to get to that?
I will get to that in a minute.
Okay.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
All right. Now the next question is why the increase over time? There was in the bottom line here is that in 2007 they collected $602 million, and by 2012 they were collecting $749 million, an increase of about 24%. Now, why was that actually happening? Let's see if we can get some insight by looking at this table, the same table you saw before, but now we're just comparing the 2 years. One possibility offhand would be that the increase in collections is because the caseload's up, but this shows otherwise. The top line total cases went from 413,000 down to 407,000. That's a decrease of about 2%. Cases with orders were also down by about 4%. Then on the other hand, when we get to cases with a collection, there's actually an increase of about 11%. Why the inconsistency? And that's because the collection rate, the cases with order, well, that stayed the same, but the collection rate here, cases with a collection, as percent of cases with orders went up from about 38% to 44%. In other words, HRA was improving the process over this period of time. So in spite of the decrease in the numbers there, they were collecting more often, and so the bottom line is that was driving up total collections. There was also an increase in the average collection in the bottom line here of about 12%.
There were fewer welfare cases.
There were fewer welfare cases.
Also.
I will also get to that. But overall, if we look, then what's driving it, in spite of the decrease in overall cases, there is an efficiency increase here in collection. Plus, there's some increase in the average collection. So that's driving the increase if we look at the overall picture. Now, what I'm going to look at now is the same thing, but I'm going to break it out for each one of the three categories, and this will provide a lot more insight. First of all, current cash assistance cases. What's happening here? Well, total cases is down by about 4%, cases with orders by about 13%. What's happening there is that the number of people on welfare continued to go down during this time. Between 2007 and 2012, the number of family cases was down by 9%. So that's not a big surprise there. There was some increase in efficiency here. Cases with collection of percentage of orders, they were going up by about 2 percentage points. And the collections per case stayed about the same. So you combine the decrease in the numbers of cases, and average was not going up, the average payment, the overall payment actually went down here from about 39 million to 36 million, or about 9%. So if we're trying to answer the question of why were the overall numbers up, it wasn't because of this group. It was in spite of this group. Okay, the second group, the former cash assistance group. In this case, we would also expect this group to go down because the base of people who were formerly on cash assistance and still have children under 21 is dropping. So that beginning in the 1990s, the welfare case though was going down very, very fast. So if you looked at it in, say, 2000, there were probably a lot of people formerly on cash assistance, but over time their children have aged out as far as OCSD goes. So this base is getting smaller and smaller and smaller also, and you can see that total cases down by about 12%, cases with orders down by 17%, cases with a collection down not quite as much, by about 2% because the efficiency of the collections is going up for this group, as you can see. In fact, that's most impressive of all. That went up about 5 percentage points there. But the one thing that's countering those trends is that if you look at the collections per case, that actually went up by about 9%. For some reason, they're getting more money from these people, and that was not enough to offset the decline in cases, so that the total annual collections went actually up by about 6 or 7%. So this group is contributing modestly to the overall increase in collections. But the real story is with this group, the never on cash assistance group, right? In that case, total cases are up by 17%, cases with orders by 22%. So what's happening here? Turns out that HRA is seeing the trends. They know that the public assistance groups are going to go down, so they started marketing themselves much more to this group that's never been involved with the system before. Right. The word's been put out that the service is available, and it's basically free. Right? You don't need to hire a lawyer if your former husband or boyfriend or whatever is not supporting the kid. They will do it for you. They've done all kinds of things to market themselves to get the word out, and that's beginning to show. Cases with a collection are up by a full 29% there. Case collections for case up by about 7%. If you put all together, the total annual collections dollar-wise went up by 38% among that group. And that accounts for about 90% of the total gain in all dollars over this period.
That's just Ron Perlman, right?
So like some billionaire can just have the city. Yes.
If the billionaire's girlfriend or wife or it could go after that could happen.
Well, one suspects they're not the target audience, but that actually
not Ivana Trump.
Yeah, but when you said early on that there's a national database that HRA draws on, is that national database, is that government data also available to private attorneys?
I don't know the answer to that.
There might actually be some, if it's not, there might actually be some advantage to going to.
There's no, it certainly is not incentive for the city to hide it. When this used to be, up until 2004, OCSC was an ACS, and they actually had something called their Hall of Shame or something on the website where they would post, and it was kind of fun to look at. It would be people guys making lots of money who were like $300,000 behind their payment. So they would publicize this to humiliate the guy. So they're not trying to hide that. Then if the attorney came to them, I would assume that they would help them out. Private attorney.
But most of the cases that HRA is dealing with are low-income
Exactly.
cases, and I think maybe you're going to get to this, but HRA also makes an effort to help with the employment and job training of the absent parent, at least for the cash assistance.
As part of that change in philosophy I mentioned before. And it turns out that the biggest problems affecting, as you saw, are from low-income fathers, right? So in order to get at that, they instituted new programs, including jobs programs for. There are programs that there's a child care credit, the earned income tax credit, which didn't apply to these people before, now does, both at the state level and the city level. And it turns out if they're making an honest effort to make a payment, but then OCSC decides the payments have been set too high, they'll actually lower it for them, so they're no longer in default. There have been cases where they will forgive some of the arrears if the person has reformed and now he's making payments. And also there are programs to get them to mediate between the two parents to get them back involved with the family stuff. So yeah, all those things have been instituted. And I think that accounts for some of the collections gain that you saw, particularly among the low income.
So they're not deadbeat dads anymore.
Not deadbeat dads.
But in these cases, there's no revenue to the city or compensation essentially for these services provided in any way.
One slide away from that. So one big thing that's happening is the composition of the caseload is changing, right? And you can see that here to summarize from 2007 to 2012. Current cash assistance used to be 13%. It's now down about 12%. Former is was 55. That's dropped a lot to 48%. And the never cash assistance cases used to be 32%, and now 40% of the overall caseload. It's about 8.5 percentage point gain, pretty large. There is a national trend in this direction, but I went back and checked the figures, and it turns out that the trend in New York City is much more pronounced for whatever reason.
The never cash assistance, do we have any knowledge on the range of income?
No. I attempted to get that data, but yeah, made sure I didn't have that available. Okay, last point here, and that is that we're going to get to the fiscal side. That how does this help the city? Right? And first of all, OCSC collections offset some of the grant costs for cash assistance recipients. In 2012, OCSC retained $25 million from current cash assistance cases and $24 million from arrears cases. So that, as I mentioned, for current cash assistance cases, the mother gets to keep $100 or $200 if it's more than one kid. The rest goes to the city. That amounted to $25 million in 2012 that the city got to keep. In addition, they're going after these old cases, these arrear cases. Some of them were in arrears back at the time when the mother was on cash assistance, so they're still liable for those payments. So if they succeed in getting those arrears payments, the city gets to keep them, and that's the $24 million. So there were a total of $49 million brought into the city. The city gained from that in 2012, which it turns out is about 3/4 of their whole budget. It's about $64 million. Right?
So what you have is poor fathers subsidizing rich mothers.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, if you think of it as operating the system, yeah.
But mothers are scarcely rich. I mean, they
No,
just be
richer.
right above.
Yeah. I don't mean rich.
That's why I asked that, because the thresholds of poverty and cash assistance are so high that you could have in the never cash assistance.
Equally poor.
Yes, exactly.
Just above.
Just above
Yeah,
official
yeah.
poverty lines.
Does this recovery go into the HRA budget or into the general fund? Do you know?
It goes back to OCSA.
Oh, seriously.
So these people, the 24 million in arrears, that's what I thought I was commenting on before, where I said, does it go to the mother? It doesn't, apparently. It goes back to...
This part doesn't. They're still gaining. They're much better off because they're still getting not only the public assistance grant, but the extra $100 or $200 a month. So So they're gaining as well. Now, I mean, this could, if this trend continues, it leads to certain interesting issues like if more and more upper income people are getting, should they be charged some kind of a fee here? And you know, that issue may arise.
So it doesn't yet pay for itself. Is there
Well,
another slide?
This part,
Another slide, yes.
we know they're collecting at least $49 million against that 64, right? Now, how else is it benefiting the city? Child support collections likely keep many families off, so it's just by raising their incomes. I mean, you're not going to be eligible for maybe food stamps or and this is very hard to quantify. I tried, I worked with HRA. However, we get some sense of what it could be if we take a scenario. As I mentioned earlier, there are about 45,000 former cash assistance cases receiving collections each month. If even 10% of these would fall back on the welfare if they didn't get those collections, that would cost an extra $30 million right there. If it was 20%, it's $60 million, right? In addition to that, there are likely savings in other programs. For instance, in Medicaid, all child support orders should include a medical side as well. If the father has health insurance, he's required to put his kid on it. So that's probably keeping a lot of kids off of Medicaid. So although we can't quantify it, if you put all this together, the savings and cash assistance, the savings in Medicaid, the savings in other programs, if you add that to the $49 million, certainly this program is more than paying for itself. That's it. Okay, conclusions. Child support collections through OCSC have increased steadily over the last several years. This reflects in part improvements in collecting payments from cases with orders. A larger factor, however, is the increasing share of cases who have never been on cash assistance. And then finally, OCSC collections offset some cash assistance grant costs and likely reduce the number of families receiving government assistance. Any questions?
Any more questions?
Fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, and next up is Sean Campion, who's going to be looking at a profile of New York's industrial workforce.
Go for it. Good morning, again, my name is Sean Campion. So back in June, we released a series of data tables and graphs, some of which are circulating around, that took an in-depth look at the city's industrial workforce, gathering demographic data and labor statistics to get a better sense of not just what jobs are out there, but what these people who are actually holding these jobs are, where they live, and what kind of money they earn. So before we get too deep into it, I just wanted to note that the city currently defines the industrial sector as made up of the construction, manufacturing, wholesale trade, transportation, and warehousing sectors. There's no one national definition of what an industrial business is or what the industrial sector comprises, but this is what the city uses. So for the sake of our analysis, we're defining it that way as well. Now going into this report, we noted that city officials tend to support the industrial sector for a variety of reasons, ranging from an interest in diversifying the city's economy to a desire to produce goods and provide services locally, and probably most commonly in the belief that industrial businesses are an important source of jobs, and in particular quality jobs for workers without a college degree. And when advocates frequently cite statistics in support of this, they very often do so at an aggregate level. For example, looking at average wages across all 5 of those sectors, or even just one of them in particular, or looking at the number of jobs that might be available to workers without a college degree, without linking those two things and actually understanding what jobs are out there for particular workers and how different sectors may provide different job outcomes for different types of workers. So going to dive a little bit more into the subject, we wanted to ask 2 questions. First, we want to see, do industrial businesses actually employ a larger share of workers without a college degree relative to businesses in other sectors of the economy outside of the industrial sector? And second, do workers without a college degree earn higher wages in industrial jobs as compared with jobs elsewhere in the economy? So to answer this first question, we want to look first at the share of total employment in different sectors by educational attainment. So on the vertical axis here is the share of total workforce in the city. And then we're breaking it out into 4 different educational attainment buckets. Workers without a high school degree, workers with a high school degree, workers with some college or an associate's degree, and those workers with a bachelor's degree or higher. And here we're breaking it into 3 different economic buckets. First, the industrial sector, which again was construction, manufacturing, wholesale trade, transportation, and warehousing, except we're breaking out construction here separately. Part of that's because the construction industry is much larger than the other, so we wanted to isolate its sort of influence on its own. And again, you'll see why construction tends to be an outlier later in the report. And we also wanted to look at the rest of the private sector to see how the industrial businesses stack up against them. And as you can see here, industrial firms are in fact more likely to employ workers without a college degree than the private sector as a whole, or non-industrial businesses as well. So we can hear, for example, about 70% of the workforce in industrial businesses, excluding construction, have less than a college degree. That number is even higher. It rises to about 84% in the construction industry. And both of these are much higher than non-industrial businesses, where only about half of the workforce doesn't have a college degree.
Does that non-industrial sector include, like, nonprofits, universities, et cetera?
Yes, that's literally everything else in the private sector. We're just looking at the private sector. So again, taking the same question of whether industrial firms are more likely to employ workers without a college degree, we want to look at it in greater detail. So not just industrial, not just non-industrial, but for example, looking at finer level detail, things like food manufacturing, trucking, etc. And here we're looking at the same question. Here on the horizontal axis is the share of jobs in the sector that are held by workers without a college degree. And we're sort of stacking up individual industries against each other. Here we're looking at 2 different groups of businesses. Shaded in blue here are industrial businesses. So for example, trucking, paper manufacturing, transit and ground transportation, food manufacturing, etc. We also want to compare these industrial sectors to a selected group of non-industrial sectors, including some from the service economy, which are more likely to employ workers without a college degree, includes things like retail, nursing, accommodation, personal services, repair, and so on. And also another group up here, scientific R&D, motion picturing, sound, and broadcasting, which the city frequently recruits to locate in industrial buildings or industrial areas owned by the city. So for example, Steiner Studios is now expanding in the Brooklyn Navy Yard to build out sound stages and film production facilities. And the city also has a biotech incubator in the Brooklyn Army Terminal. So these are some of the uses that are not technically industrial, but are frequently locating in city-owned industrial properties and competing with other industrial uses. And we also want to stack it up against the average in the private sector as a whole, which, blending industrial and non-industrial together, is about 55% of the workforce. And again, we find that,
in personal services,
yes.
Given it is so high, what is included there? Types of
So that's like hair care, nail salons.
cleaning services as well?
I don't think cleaning services are in there. It's more just sort of like, it's personal care in a lot of cases.
And would home health aides, for example, be in nursing care? No. Where would, home care?
Home care would be in nursing.
Home care would be
Yeah, okay.
So you can see on the whole, most industrial businesses, most industrial sectors do tend to employ a larger share of workers without a college degree, particularly relative to the private sector average as a whole. You see, in many cases, it ranges from 70% in apparel manufacturing, going up to 85% in food manufacturing, and as much as 90% in trucking. But there are also a few businesses that fall below the private sector average. More advanced manufacturing, for example, stands out. Chemical manufacturing, which includes pharmaceuticals, and computer and electronics manufacturing, tend to employ about 40-45% share of workers without a college degree, which is below both the private sector average and the averages of many industrial sectors. And as well as sort of these sort of new economy sectors as well, like film and TV, scientific research and R&D, which includes biotech, also tend to fall below that level.
So you're saying that some of what the city is working hardest to attract to the former manufacturing areas is are in fact employing a relatively small number of less educated people.
Yes.
Okay.
So they wind up having a much different workforce and having much different labor force outcomes than if you were to attract businesses in food manufacturing or transportation or warehousing, for example. However, there is a trade-off to this question, is when we get to the issue of wages. Again, we want to ask, not only are industrial businesses more likely to employ workers without a college degree, but what kind of wages do these jobs earn in those industrial jobs? So now, this is sort of a different structure, so I'm going to go through it again. On the vertical axis here, we have an estimated average hourly wage earned by workers. And then now we're sort of breaking them out into the four different educational attainment buckets here. So within each, we're looking at, for example, workers with less than a high school degree. We're breaking out into, again, industrial excluding construction, specifically the construction industry, and then again, all non-industrial sectors. And what we find is that, particularly once you isolate construction, it seems that the construction industry is actually driving most of that wage premium earned by industrial workers now in the New York City economy. And that holds true for all groups of workers without a college degree. So for example, among those with less than a high school degree, construction workers earn on average about $19 an hour, versus more or less $14 an hour, both in the rest of the industrial sector, as well as outside of the industrial sector. And this pattern holds true again for workers that have a college degree, or winds up being about 28 versus around $20 an hour outside of construction. And again here, a little over $30 for those with some college or an associate's degree, versus about 26 outside. The one exception though is for workers with a college degree. Workers with a college degree, both in the industrial sector and in construction, tend to earn less than workers with a college degree in the rest of the private sector.
Do you have a breakdown by gender?
No, we didn't bring it up by gender.
Is it available?
It is available though. Yeah.
It's an obvious question, but
Yeah, and I know in some cases there are some sectors that do have pronounced gender splits. Construction, for example, is dominant male. Apparel manufacturing is overwhelmingly women, particularly immigrant women and women of color. So there are some differences. We get into some of those issues later, but we didn't specifically break out by gender. And again, as we did for the workforce, sorry.
Do you have a breakdown if any of those folks are veterans or have looked at that?
No, that is also available. We didn't do that. So again, we want to look at this in greater detail as we do with the share of jobs held by workers without a college degree. So this bubble chart here is pretty complicated, so I'm going to walk you through. So essentially there are 3 data points graphed on this chart. First, on the vertical axis here is the share of jobs held by workers without a college degree. On the horizontal here is the average hourly wage earned by workers without a college degree. And then the size of bubbles here is scaled to the total employment in New York City. So once you sort of graph all of these industries here, so if you go back, for example, just taking all of these industries here and then plotting them against each other using all of this information, and you can sort of see a few trends that emerge. So first of all, you can see that there's a fairly distinct negative relationship between the average hourly wage earned by workers without a college degree and the share of jobs that are open to those workers. So you see that, for example, again, these sort of newer economy, advanced manufacturing, film and TV, and biotech, tends to be they tend to pay higher wages to workers without a college degree, but there are also fewer jobs available to those workers. And also, when you're plotting against here, these red lines are the private sector averages. So again, the private sector average for workers without a college degree is about $21 an hour, and workers without a college degree form about 55% of the entire city's workforce. You can sort of divide this into 4 quadrants. Starting up here in this upper red quadrant, which are workers that earn an above average hourly wage, and also have an above average share of jobs held by workers without a college degree. You can see there are a few businesses up there that stand out. Again, construction being a notable outlier. But you also pick up a few others in the industrial sector, sort of straddling the line here. You have trucking, transportation support, wholesale trade, and then this is fabricated metal construction, manufacturing as well. And then also a non-industrial sector that stands out as accommodation. We didn't get too much into details of exactly why these businesses stand out as being above average in both cases. It's possible that it could be related to higher rates of unionization. It could be more money is being invested in skill training and development, so that there may be a skill premium that's also demanding a wage premium as well. Again, in the bottom right here, quadrant is businesses that have a below average share of jobs available to a college degree but a higher wage. And again, we discussed those. Everything else sort of falls into this upper left quadrant, which is sectors that have an above average share of jobs held by workers without a college degree, but a below average hourly wage relative to the private sector as a whole. And that includes not only sort of the large service sector industries such as retail, food service, nursing, daycare, but also a number of industrial businesses. You see food manufacturing shows up here in this quadrant. Apparel manufacturing as well, furniture manufacturing is in here. So even though even though sort of they stand out as being an important share of jobs, many of them offer wages that are, many industrial sectors offer wages that are comparable or even slightly a little bit higher than the service sector, but they're sort of still in this range of the economy with the service sector as well. The other thing to know that stands out is you get a sense of the total employment in many of these sectors is relatively small relative to some of the other areas of the economy. So, for example, food manufacturing, the attention it gets is a relatively small size relative to the entire food service sector as a whole. Same with apparel manufacturing, for example, versus retail. But again, on the other side, you can see the size of, for example, the wholesale trade sector or the construction sector as well, which not only provide an above average share of jobs for workers without a college degree, but in the aggregate a large number of jobs as well, where some of these others, such as manufacturing and also more advanced sectors of the economy as well, provide a smaller total share. And lastly, we also included in the back of the report some more detailed labor and demographic data about the workforces in particular sectors. I'm just going to highlight food manufacturing today, and not just because Brooklyn beer and pickles and artisanal food production is in vogue, but for a couple other reasons. The biggest one, for example, is that, as you see here, food manufacturing is the only manufacturing sector that's actually growing in terms of total employment in the city, not just in the past few years, but also since the year 2000 as well. So I'm just going to walk you through this sort of one by one. So first, looking at breaking out the food manufacturing workforce by ethnicity. You see, for example, that food manufacturing tends to play a much larger share of Hispanics relative to the city's economy as a whole. About 41% of the food manufacturing workforce is Hispanic, relative to about a quarter of the private workforce. Again, now looking at the share of jobs held by workers without a college, or share of jobs filled by New York City residents, you see that workers in food manufacturing are more likely to live in the city than workers as a whole. About 90% of the food manufacturing workforce also in New York City also lives in New York City. Now getting back to the question of wages, turns out wages in food manufacturing are relatively less than the private sector as a whole. Not just for, it's true across all jobs, where all jobs in food manufacturing earn on average about $19 an hour versus about $35 for the city as a whole. And that's true for workers both with and without a college degree. Looking at workers without a college degree, workers earn on average about $17 an hour versus jobs, the total private sector is about 21. And it's also true for workers with a college degree, who earn about $30 an hour in food manufacturing as compared to about $50 an hour in the private sector as a whole. And then finally, we also wanted to get a sense of what the actual jobs are that are available in food manufacturing. So I'm blowing this up. So we want to look, for example, at the 10 most common occupations that are employed in food manufacturing in New York State, which range from things you'd expect: bakers, food batch makers and packers, all the way down to cafeteria workers and cashiers if they have a retail operation as well, down to the truck drivers who deliver the products. And we want to look at a few different, get a better sense of what these jobs are, and who's holding these jobs, and what they pay. As you can see there on the far end, most commonly workers in food manufacturing in all these different occupations hold a high school degree or less. Again, that's makes sense given the fact that 85% of jobs in New York City in food manufacturing are held by workers without a college degree. But we also want to look at the wages that these actual jobs hold. And you find that they sort of fall within the range of what the city would consider to be a living wage job, which is $10 an hour with benefits, $11.50 without benefits. But the median hourly wages in New York City fall right about at that level, which means that there are a number of jobs in food manufacturing that probably wouldn't qualify as a living wage job, but a lot of them do. So sort of you're walking a fine line right there, sort of at that level. So a few conclusions, sort of as with the new mayor and a new council, or now revisiting the city's industrial policy. A couple things I think we should keep in mind. So industrial businesses are more likely than non-industrial firms to employ workers without a college degree, but with a few exceptions. So again, what we consider to be the industrial sector is diverse and is not monolithic. And again, wages earned by non-college graduates in the industrial sector, with the notable exception of construction, are comparable or slightly higher to service sector wages as well, and wages in the private sector economy as a whole. So again, as we're considering a new industrial policy for the city, it's important to remember that different policies supporting different sectors could lead to significantly different labor market outcomes as well for New York City residents. So with that, if you have any more questions, okay.
Well, it's interesting. The second conclusion is pretty interesting because there's, I think, been an assumption that industrial jobs pay better than service sector jobs.
Right.
And you're saying, except for construction, it's not true.
It's not always true. I mean, there are, for example, food manufacturing wages are higher than food service wages, but the premium isn't as large as it would be if you blend wages together with, for example, construction, with jobs in more advanced manufacturing as well.
And I think when we think of industrial, we think of manufacturing, and we think of heavily unionized sectors where wages and benefits have traditionally been decent. And that's less true today.
Do you have data on the amount of unionization in these different occupations?
I don't. We didn't look at that in particular, but I'm not. Most of this data was drawn from the Census Bureau's American Community Survey, which doesn't include variables on whether or not workers belong to a union or not. So it's hard to tease out in particular what the difference was between workers.
The other factor that might be driving some wages, but probably not many, is the city's living wage movement, the extent to which public money influences any of these wage levels.
I think that now will be coming through as it's being enforced a lot more in the new administration than was in the previous administration.
Could I ask, as far as you had a breakdown of the food manufacturing sector, but I wanted to understand whether or not you have that breakdown available in the film and media and entertainment sector.
I don't think we included it in the back. But I can do the similar analysis for that.
Because what's interesting is that you were able to determine that you have more of the food manufacturing employees living in New York City. Would the same be true with the film, media, and entertainment sector, considering the tax benefits that are poured into what would be this line of work, and yet I don't think that there's an alignment with those benefits contributing back to the New York City resident.
I have that analysis. I didn't include it here, but I have it.
Fantastic.
I can get it for you afterwards.
Fantastic. Absolutely. Thank you, Ronnie. And I understand this breakdown as far as just looking at the policies are concerned. Were there any interesting recommendations that you feel would support areas that are not receiving the proper programs or a lack of tax abatement or benefits Because I know that we were heavily focused on, in the last 13 years, on food manufacturing. Therefore, an increase to support what would be those types of jobs, especially for non-college degrees. And so I wanted to see if there's a step beyond what would be just the presentation, and is there any recommendation? And in what sector?
Well, we don't typically make recommendations, which is...
Did you draw a conclusion?
Yeah, I think one of the conclusions I draw is, in particular, when we're looking at, for example, with the Brooklyn Navy Yard, where there's competing demands from different industrial users, and even users such as the film studios are now part of the industrial sector, it does lead to different job outcomes. And I think some things that lost in debate, particularly if we're just focused on living wage or not living wage, is the share of jobs are actually going to be available for different types of workers, and the quality of those jobs. And there's a balance to be had between, for example, higher wage jobs in computer or pharmaceutical manufacturing or film and TV, which provide higher paying jobs but fewer jobs overall. As well between wholesale trade and wholesaling businesses versus manufacturing businesses, where there are a lot more in the aggregate of wholesaling jobs versus manufacturing jobs, so maybe more job intensive as well. So again, without making recommendations, sort of like these are things that we would sort of highlight and point out.
We also looked at the ages of where the demographics are. So who's getting these types of jobs? Is it more seniors? Is it younger folks? Who were the people occupying?
We did look at just nothing that we can look at. Get back to you on that. I know anecdotally, for example, so apparel manufacturing, for example, is particularly on the production side and production occupations. Those jobs tend to be held by older workers, and that there are fewer younger workers coming in to replace, particularly, if you look at the average age, it's mostly women sort of over the age of 45 or 50, and there are very few younger people coming in to replace that. We can get your
And I think I'm assuming it's Asian and Latino women?
Yeah.
Right.
Is there any data on the difference between the sectors or the occupations relative to mobility? Professional mobility, employment
just
mobility?
in terms of job advancement within
job
sectors?
advancement and raises and et cetera?
No,
They
it's tough to look at. I mean, that's something more of a qualitative piece, understanding, for example, within like a construction unit, how someone moves from an apprentice all the way up to a master. And we didn't get into that just because we were focused much more sort of on this quantitative side.
That's also not it. I mean,
it's not in ECS.
It's not in
Can't do it.
ECS.
It's not easy. You can't
I
follow
mean,
one
there might
person.
There might be other ways of getting at it.
Trends,
but-
yeah. Thank you.
One of the challenges of looking at hourly wages and comparing sectors is you don't catch the volatility of different kinds of jobs.
Right.
Construction, for example, has so much related to the business cycle, and there are other occupations you're looking at that have a lot of volatility in hours worked. I think ACS lets you look at annual average earnings.
Yes.
That might be another way of getting at another kind of information, or average hours worked per sector might be another way of getting at that kind of information.
Yeah, so this is one of the challenges, knowing that there are different labor patterns and different work patterns in different industries. The way we came to our average hourly wage estimates was, ACS and the Census Bureau data reports, individual workers report their annual wages, and then their typical hours worked in a week and the number of weeks that they worked in a year. So we want to sort of normalize it across different industries, people working full-time, part-time, full year, part year, so that everything is on a level playing field. But again, that's something we didn't get into, sort of the differences in hours worked in different industries.
Yeah, but somewhere to think about the policy.
Sean and Paul, those were two very good, interesting presentations. Thank you very much. We have a personnel matter to discuss. I'd like to have us go into executive session to discuss that. Could I have a motion?
Moved.
Yes. Second, all in favor. Thank you.